So similar to the other approaches to research that we've talked about so far this chapter, there are certainly pros and cons to doing experiments. The biggest advantage is that the researchers can talk about cause and effect, right? And they can also distinguish what we call placebo effects from treatment effects. And so I haven't quite mentioned that yet. So a placebo effect is simply where someone expects something to happen and therefore reports that it happened. And so we see this more so with like medication trials, that when individuals participate in a study on antidepressants, if they know that they are being prescribed an antidepressant, they tend to report that their mood improves, even if they're not given a real pill. So if they're given what we call like a sugar pill or a placebo, they'll still say that they feel better. And we see actually pretty strong placebo effects with a lot of things. Alcohol, for example, if people expect to get drunk, then they tend to get drunker. Even if you give them something that's like a non-alcoholic substance that tastes like beer or tastes like an alcoholic beverage. And so experiments really are the one way that we can truly test cause and effect, which would include ruling things out like placebo effects. And it does this because it allows the researcher to have more control over the situation. And what I mean by that is designing a study in a way that we can test whether it's an alternative explanation, right? We can feel more confident that the flashcards caused the improvement in grade and not better sleep, improved motivation, or settling in and getting used to college, right? So it allows control over that, our ability to test that question. But the disadvantages, one is that the situation's fake because the researcher's creating or manipulating the variable. So it isn't a student who just naturally decides, I'm going to start to study with flashcards. They're being assigned that condition. And so it can be kind of hard to determine how real life the results are. And then it can also be hard to avoid experimenter effects. The researcher themselves can influence the participants because, again, they're in the situation. They're the one assigning the condition. They're assigning the participant to a group. And so we have to consider whether the experimenter themselves could be influencing the outcomes of the study. So let's talk a little bit about evaluating findings. And so there's lots of statistical tools that researchers can use, one of them being descriptive statistics. And so the two most commonly used statistical tools for talking about just kind of generally what we observed in a study are the mean and the standard deviation. And mean is exactly what you know it to be. It's where you add up all of the values you observed and then divide by the number of values, and it gives you the average or the mean. But there's a few problems with the mean, and I'll talk about those in a second. The standard deviation, on the other hand, tells you more about what the distribution looks like. So is it that, generally speaking, everybody in the sample scored similarly, or was there a wide range? So for example, if I came back to the class after quiz 1 and said the average was a 70, one of your first questions should be, well, what was the standard deviation? Was it that everybody scored between 65 and 75? Or did a few people get zeros and a few people got hundreds? So what was the spread of the data? So mean and standard deviation are two tools that we can use to describe the statistics or describe the data set to other people. But as I said, there's certainly flaws with these statistics. The mean has two big flaws. One of them is that just because it's the mathematical average or the mean of the data set doesn't mean it even represents anyone. So here the circles represent people, and so we can see 1, 2, 3, 5 people scored a 5 on whatever this measure is, and 5 people scored a 15. And so the mean is a 10, but you can see there's no circles here. So that means that the mean of the data set is not actually representative of everyone, and that's problematic because the mean, many people kind of see it as like the average person, but here you can see there isn't even a person here. The other issue is that, as I just kind of alluded to, the mean doesn't tell you anything about how spread out the data were. So here we can see that the mean is 5, and over on this data set, the mean is 5 as well. But look how much more clustered the data points are here compared to over here. So we see much more variety in the responses among our participants. And so it's important to consider what is the best way to present your data. And that isn't necessarily the easiest way or the way that you know how. The best way is going to be the most honest. Because if you say, for example, the average or the mean is 10 on this, then people are going to probably assume that that means that that is the most typical or kind of an average person. But in actuality, it doesn't represent anyone. And so we can really use statistics to kind of manipulate people. And so it's important for scientists to make sure that they aren't, that they're being as truthful as they can be and as transparent as we talked about before. We also have to consider whether or not differences we observe are meaningful. So let's go back to the flashcard example. So let's pretend this is the exam grades for that class. So people in the no flashcard group on average got an 80. People in the flashcard group, it looks like maybe about an 84. It's kind of hard to tell on the graph because the axis only has every 10 data points. But what we can see is that this bar goes higher than this bar. But the question is it meaningful? If you were a student in that class, you should say, well, Dr. Wilson, would I really do that much better? Would it be a meaningful improvement? And so for some of you, you might say a 4-point improvement is not worth the effort of making flashcards or the tediousness of having to study with flashcards. I mean, that's not always very fun. And so one of the questions that researchers have to try to answer is whether or not the difference is meaningful. And part of that is trying to determine whether the results occurred by chance. Because it's possible that just by chance, this flashcard group did better than this no flashcard group. And if we were to do this study on the next exam and the next exam and the next exam, it's possible that every other time this no flashcard group is going to do better, right? Let's say even 10 points better. We don't know. Because part of trying to determine whether or not results are meaningful is you have to try to determine if you got those results just by chance. And so we use statistics, they're called inferential statistics, to try to infer whether or not the result or the outcome is just due to chance. And so we use a cutoff of 5%, which is also expressed as P equals 0.05, 0.05 meaning 5%. And so what we're allowing is that we can make the mistake up to about 5 times out of 100 repetitions. So we allow a little room for error. Because psychology is based on probability. It is not a certain thing. We just want to know how likely is it that we're maybe making the wrong conclusion. And so we do allow a small area of error. And so that's why, going back to chapter 1, researchers use cautionary language. We do not make definitive statements. We talk about that sometimes variables are related, or under what circumstances variables are related. All of that cautionary language is because we're relying on inferential statistics, which is all based on probability. And the last thing I just want to touch on is ethics. Again, your book does a really nice job of this, so I won't get too into detail here, but I just want to at least talk about informed consent. Psychology has a little bit of a rough history in terms of conducting ethical research. When we, in a couple chapters, we'll talk about like the Stanford prison experiment, for example, and some, like an example where participants were allowed to shock people, like electrically shock people, or at least they thought they were. And so this brings up a lot of questions about, are we potentially doing emotional harm to people? And so after the field kind of had a few missteps early on, we really started to better appreciate our participants and working hard to keep them safe. And so part of that is what we call the informed consent process. And so what we agreed on as a field is that participants need to be able to voluntarily participate. It should be their decision. Because that was one of the missteps early on, was that participants didn't know they were participating in a research study. For example, in one study, they thought they were getting medical treatment. And so participants need to be informed of what they're going to be asked to do, what the risks are, what the potential benefits are, and how they can opt out at any point if they want to. And so the informed consent really is a process where the researcher is supposed to teach the participant about the expectations, to teach them about the risks, answer any questions. It's supposed to be a dialogue. And so it's this opportunity for the participants to determine whether they truly want to participate or not. But I do want to point out that deceit is often necessary, because if participants always knew what researchers were doing, our research wouldn't work, right? So like, let's say I'm doing a study on cheating. If you came in and the first line of the informed consent said, I'm studying cheating, I can tell you no one's going to cheat because they know what I'm looking for and they don't want to be a cheater. Whereas if I just kind of set up a natural testing situation, maybe with really hard questions and the opportunity to cheat, well, participants are going to be more likely to cheat, which means I'm more likely to be able to actually test my question. But it means I'm going to have to withhold information from participants. And so part of conducting research is going through a review process where other experts determine whether it's safe for you to do your study and whether it is worth any risks. And one of the risks could be that you have to deceive your participants. And so what we always do at the end is debrief participants about if any information was withheld or why they might have been misled and what the purpose was. And so the informed consent is a process that carries the whole way through the research study and ends with debriefing, which is an opportunity for the researcher to reveal any information and try to address any concerns that the participant might have. And so informed consent is just one part of it. There's a lot of issues that come up with ethics. One of the things I love about this class is you guys get the opportunity to be a research participant, part of that research participation requirement. So you get to see what an informed consent looks like. Because your studies are going to be online, it's mostly just going to be reading an informed consent, but it can really give you a kind of sense and a flavor of what that information can look like. And you might have to make some tough decisions about whether you feel comfortable participating in a particular study once you see what the informed consent is. And it's also possible that a researcher might deceive you a little bit. And so it's going to be interesting to see how you react to that, how you learn, or how you feel once you learn during the debriefing that maybe you were misled a little bit during a study. So again, that's why we require that, because it's kind of an important experience for people to have to truly understand some of the ethical issues related to research. So that's all I have for chapter 2. Again, please let me know if you have any questions about anything in this lecture. I really think that the discussion board topic for this week, as well as the class activity, are just totally on point in terms of highlighting some of the big issues related to this chapter. So let me know if you have questions about that too. And please take those assignments seriously because it certainly will help you better learn this information and better appreciate some of the main concerns. So hope you're having a great week, and certainly reach out to me if you have questions.